previous segment, we spoke about the revolutions of the last 2 centuries, particularly the decline of the family and the community, and the rise of the state and the market. What we said is that they have been very swift and very radical. They have been so swift and so radical that they managed to change the most fundamental aspect of the social order. Traditionally, the social order, no matter how it looked like, was hard and rigid. Order implied stability and continuity. Swift social revolutions were very rare and exceptional. Most transformations in human society resulted from the accumulation of numerous small steps over decades and centuries. Humans therefore tended to assume that the social structure is inflexible and eternal. Families and communities might struggle to change their place within the order, but the idea that you could change the fundamental structure of the order itself, this was usually sounded impossible. People tended to reconcile themselves to the status quo, to the way things are, by declaring that, okay, we may not like the social order, but this is how it always was, and this is how it always will be. Over the last 2 centuries, the pace of social change became so rapid that the character of the social order changed, and the social order came to be something which is constantly changing, something very flexible, something very dynamic. When we speak about modern revolutions, we tend to think about particular years as being revolutionary. Say 1789, the French Revolution, 1848, the Liberal Revolutions, or 1917, the Russian Communist Revolution. But the fact is that in the last century or 2, every year is revolutionary. The society keeps changing all the time. This is why any attempt to define the characteristics of modern society is like trying to define the color of the chameleon. The only characteristic of which we can be certain is the constant change. People have become accustomed to it, they become used to it, and most of us today think about society, about the social order, as something flexible. Something which we can engineer and improve from all sides. People all the time are saying we should change this, we should change that, or other people are worrying from changes which are maybe bad, but everybody accepts it as fact that the society changes all the time. Nobody today in 2013, nobody today imagines that in 2050 the world, human society, will be the same as today. Everybody expects that the world will be very different. There are big arguments about how it should be. And there are big arguments whether the coming changes will be good or bad. But it's obvious to almost everybody that the world in 40 years, even 20 years, will be very different than what it is today. Yet, at the same time that the human order has become so volatile, it is also becoming more peaceful than ever before. We could have expected that the more changes and revolutions occur in the world and in society, the more violence there will be in the world. But in fact, at least in the last few decades, as the pace of change in the world increased, the world simultaneously became more and more peaceful than ever before. The levels of violence in the world today are lower than in any previous time in history, at least from the agricultural revolution onwards, and by a very wide margin. First of all, the collapse of the family and the community and the rise of the state caused a decrease in internal levels of violence. This may sound incredible to you, because the news are all the time full of reports about crimes and murders and so forth, not to mention wars. And there is indeed a lot of violence in the world today. What I want to argue is not that there is no violence at all. What I want to argue is that there is less violence than ever before. These are two very different things. Now, if you want to appreciate the level of violence in the world as a whole, over time, over history, then reading newspaper stories about a particular murder case is not helpful. What we need to find out is whether on average, when taking hundreds of millions of people together, whether on average there are today more cases of murder than there were 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. We need to look at statistics, not at individual cases. Now, one very interesting statistic concerns the percentage of violent death from the sum total of death cases in the world. In the year 2000, wars caused a total of 310,000 deaths. 310,000 people died from wars in the year 2000. Violent crime killed another 520,000 people. So altogether in the year 2000, 830,000 people died from human violence. This sounds a lot of people, 830,000. And each of these people, each of these victims is a world destroyed, a family ruined, friends and relatives harmed, scarred for life. Yet, we have to look at these numbers from a macro perspective of the whole world and of hundreds of years. And from these macro perspective, we see that the 830,000 victims of violence in the year 2000 comprised just 1.5% of death in that year. Because in that year, the year 2000, a total of 56 million people died around the world from all causes together. To put things in perspective, note that in the year 2000, about 1,260,000 people died from car accidents, much more than from violence. And 815,000 people committed suicide. The figures for the year 2002 are even more surprising. In 2002, a total of 57 million people died that year. Only 172,000 people died in war, and 569,000 people died from violent crime. So a total of 741,000 people died from human violence in 2002. In contrast, 873,000 people committed suicide, killed themselves. It turns out that in the year after the 9/11 attacks, despite all the talk about terrorism and war and so forth, the average person was more likely to kill himself than to be killed by a terrorist or a soldier or a drug dealer or some other criminal. The fact is that in most parts of the world, people today enjoy a level of security from human violence that our ancestors could hardly even imagine or dream about. In most parts of the world, not in all parts, but in most parts of the world, people go to sleep at night without fear that in the middle of the night a neighboring tribe or village will surround their village and slaughter everybody or kidnap them and sell them to slavery. We travel from place to place with far less fear of, again, being killed or being kidnapped or pirates or whatever. this course is being filmed in Tel Aviv. But I don't live in Tel Aviv. I live in a small village near New Jerusalem. So when I come to film this course, I have to travel. I get into my car and I travel for 40 minutes to Tel Aviv. Now, when I go into the car, I fear maybe there'll be a car accident. But I don't fear that in the middle of the road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, some slave gang will stop the car and kidnap me and sell me to slavery, or just murder me. 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, in the same place, under the rule of the Ottoman Empire or the Mamluk Empire, this was a constant fear of people. When somebody left Jerusalem and traveled to Jaffa, to the port of Jaffa, he or she knew that it was not unlikely that on the way they will be robbed, they will be murdered, or they will be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Today, not in all parts of the world, but in most parts of the world, people are not concerned about such possibilities because it's very unlikely for such a thing to happen. The decline in violence, the rising level of security, is due above all to the rise of the power of the state. Throughout history, most violence resulted from local feuds, local conflicts between families and communities. Most of the violence was very local. Even today, local crime is far deadlier than international wars. As we saw in the above statistics, in the year 2002, for example, 172,000 people died in international wars between states, but 569,000 people died from violent crime within small communities and families. When states did not exist at all, and societies were organized and controlled only by families and communities, violence levels were much, much higher than they are today. One popular measurement for the levels of violence asks the following question. For a given population of 100,000 people, how many of these 100,000 people will be murdered in 1 year by another person? Today, in places like Western Europe, Australia, and Japan, for every 100,000 Australians or Japanese, only one is killed in a given year by another human. In New York, the rate is about 7 people murdered each year for every 100,000 New Yorkers. In Detroit, the murder capital of the United States, about 50 people are murdered each year for every 100,000 people in Detroit. And this is considered a lot. This is considered so violent, unacceptable. In contrast, in ancient societies of simple farmers who had no political organization larger than the local community, about 400 individuals were violently killed each year for every 100,000 people. That's 8 times more than in Detroit. As kingdoms and empires became stronger, they gradually restrained local violence because the king and emperors didn't like it when some local criminal killed their subjects who were supposed to pay taxes to them and to serve in their army and so forth. When the states and the markets became even more powerful in the modern age, and the local communities became very, very weak, and the families became weak, then violence rates dropped even more. So that today, the average for the entire world is only 9 murders a year for every 100,000 people. And these statistics most of these murders take place in places where the state is very weak such as in Somalia and Afghanistan and in parts of Colombia and Mexico and so forth. Now, it's obvious that strong states are not always good. Strong states can also do bad things. And there are quite a few cases in which states use their power to kill their own citizens. And these cases loom large in our memories and in our fears. During the 20th century, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people were killed by the security forces of their own state. Still, if we take a macro perspective, if we look at things from the perspective of statistics about billions and hundreds of years, it is still quite obvious that the courts and the police forces of the state probably increased the level of security and decreased the level of violence despite these notorious occasions when they are used to kill and to oppress the citizens of the state themselves. So this is about the drop in internal violence, in violence within states, cases when the state use its power to restrain the violence inside its borders. But what about violence between states? Even if we accept that the power of the state creates more security within the borders of the state, aren't we paying for this security by having much more violence between states, international wars? The answer, surprisingly, is no. At least since 1945, international violence has dropped even more quickly than internal violence, and today international violence is at an all-time low. There was never a period in history when the international community was so peaceful as it is today. The decline in international violence manifested itself, above all, in two fundamental developments. First of all, the relatively quick and peaceful collapse of the European empires, and secondly, the fact that the independent countries that replaced the European empires fight very few major wars between them. Let's look first at the collapse of the European empires. In 1945, the world was ruled by the empires of a few European nations, most notably Britain, France, and Russia. Within a few decades, however, these empires collapsed and were replaced by independent states. This, of course, is not the first time in history that empires collapsed. But what is unique, very unique, about the collapse of the European empires is that it was very fast and it was relatively peaceful and orderly. The collapse of the European empires was in fact the greatest transfer of power in history. Never before have so much power been transferred from the hands of one group of people to the hands of another group of people so quickly. If you go back to 1945, you find that a very small group of people, certainly in London and Paris and Moscow and several other European capitals, control almost the whole world. People in London control Nigeria and control Kenya and control India and what is today Bangladesh and Pakistan and Malaysia and so forth. People in Paris control what is today the independent countries of Senegal and Vietnam and Cambodia and so forth. And within a few decades, these people in London and Paris and Amsterdam and Moscow transferred most of their powers to the hands of new elites, new independent elites and governments in New Delhi and in Lagos and in Ho Chi Minh City and so forth that now rule these places. Now, this transfer of power, it wasn't only on a very massive scale and done very quickly, just a few decades. It was done in most cases in a relatively ordered and peaceful way. Throughout history, empires did not want to give up their powers. When there was an objection to their powers, when there was rebellion, the empire usually used all its power to crush the rebellion with an iron fist. Even when the empires became too weak to survive, still, they did not want to give up their power willingly. And they used whatever power, whatever force remained to them to try and hang on to their power for a few more years before collapsing. And when the empire finally collapsed, what replaced it was most times bloody chaos, when all kinds of forces struggle for the inheritance of the empire. For example, when the Roman Empire became weaker and weaker in the 5th century, the Romans did not willingly say, okay, now we are weak, so we'll give up our empire. No, they tried to hang on to power to the last minute with any possibility of doing it. And when the Roman Empire finally collapsed, what replaced it was a terrible and bloody struggle for control of the territories that once belonged to the empires, when all kinds of peoples, Franks and Goths and Huns and Visigoths and Vandals and so forth, fought one another ferociously for the Roman inheritance. And this was the usual thing that happened whenever a big empire collapsed. However, since 1945, most empires, when they felt that they are becoming too weak to survive, they decided to give up their power relatively peacefully and orderly. The process of imperial collapse became relatively, not totally, but relatively calm and orderly. The British Empire is a good example. Again, as I said earlier, in 1945, Britain controls maybe a quarter of the world and a quarter of the people of the world. There are places where the British tried to hang on to power using their armed forces. And there were places that when the British left, a lot of violence erupted, as for example in Palestine or Cyprus or India. But in most cases, the British Empire left not because of a rebellion that it could not subdue, but because the rulers of the empire reached the conclusion that they are too weak to go on like this. So they deliberately and willingly transferred the power to some new local elite. And in most cases, not all cases, the British flag was taken down, a new flag of an independent country was hoisted in its place, and a new country appeared without a bloody war, without killing millions of people, and with the borders and identity of the new independent country relatively secure. Again, it didn't happen like this in all cases, but in most cases. There was still, as I said, you shouldn't come from this course with an idea that there was no violence at all. There was a lot of violence when the British Empire collapsed, but compared to the historical average, compared to what usually happened when big empires collapse in history, the British withdrawal was an exemplar of peacefulness and orderliness. An even more remarkable example is the collapse of the Soviet-Russian Empire in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Despite the eruption of various local conflicts in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia, it is safe to say that never before in history has such a mighty empire disappeared so quickly, within just 2 years, so quietly, and in such an orderly manner. The Soviet Empire in 1989 did not suffer from any military defeat, except for the defeat in Afghanistan, which was a minor affair. It's not something that can cause such a big empire to collapse. It wasn't like in the Roman Empire that the empire collapsed because hordes of Germans and Huns and barbarians invaded it. Nobody invaded the Soviet Empire in 1989. Similarly, there was no serious rebellion against the Soviet Empire. Nowhere. And there was not even a campaign of civil disobedience like what Mahatma Gandhi did in India to the British. Nobody was doing it to the Soviets, except, again, one exception is the Solidarity movement in Poland. The Solidarity movement led by Lech Walesa did lead a campaign of civil disobedience in Poland, one of the countries that belong to the Soviet sphere, to the Soviet Empire. But again, solidarity, with all due respect, it wasn't what caused the Soviet Empire to collapse. The Soviets in 1989, not only they did not have to face an invasion from outside or a rebellion from within, they still controlled the largest and most powerful army in history. They had millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks and airplanes and submarines and ships, and enough nuclear weapons to destroy the whole of humankind several times over. The Red Army, the Soviet Army, and the other armies of the Warsaw Pact, of the Communist bloc, they remained loyal. If the last Soviet ruler, Mikhail Gorbachev, had given the order, the Red Army would have done whatever Mikhail Gorbachev had told him to do, even to open fire on civilians, on rebels, on all kinds of demonstrators. So there was no problem for the Soviet elite, like with the case of the Romans, that they were defeated in the field and didn't have enough military might to hang on. What happened was that the Soviet elite and the communist regimes throughout most of Eastern Europe, with the exception of Romania and Serbia, chose to dismantle the empire willingly and peacefully. They chose, when they saw that communism doesn't work, instead of using military power to try to keep the system running and to subjugate anybody who tries to oppose them, they reached the conclusion that the system isn't working properly, and they decided willingly and peacefully to simply go home, to simply renounce power. Never before in history had so much power been renounced by so few people, like the leadership of the Soviet Union. And many people like to blame the Soviet leadership for many things, but we should give them this credit at least, that they had the integrity, they had the moral sense, they had the ethical responsibility to dismantle their empire peacefully. And again, never in history before have so much power been given up so quickly by so few people. So the ultimate Nobel Peace Prize, if somebody wanted to give the ultimate Nobel Peace Prize, I at least would nominate Gorbachev and the Soviet elite for this ultimate Nobel Peace Prize, for willingly giving up so much power without causing too much trouble about it. What is even more remarkable, or equally remarkable, is that Gorbachev and his colleagues gave up in 1989 not only the Soviet Empire, a relatively new empire that was set up by Stalin after World War II, they also gave up, they also renounced the much older Russian Empire, which was set up by the Tsars in previous centuries. At the same time that the Soviet leadership gave up control of the countries in Eastern Europe, it also allowed the Russian Empire to collapse, to fragment all kinds of territories which the Tsars conquered a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries previously, like the Ukraine, like Lithuania and Estonia, like the Caucasus, like Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and these areas conquered by the Tsars in the 18th and 19th century. The Soviet leadership, when it dismantled the Soviet Empire, at the same time, it allowed all these places also to gain their independence from Moscow, from the Russian Empire. The collapsing empires of the British and the French and the Russians and the other European powers, they not only, in most cases, went home peacefully, but also they were replaced not by chaos, but by dozens of independent states. When the French and British left Africa and Asia, so dozens of new states, independent states, occupied what was previously the British and French Empire, and similarly what happened when the Soviet Empire collapsed. Now, this could have created numerous new opportunities for wars between all these new states about their borders. But, as we shall see in the next segment, most of the new states of the world, most states in the world in general, are remarkably peaceful, remarkably uninterested in war over the last few decades.